This is a picture of Bracebridge around 1904 or 1905. You'll notice the walkway, wooden walkway. It's elevated because in behind those buildings there's a rocky ledge that comes down, and they couldn't build proper basements in those buildings. So they had to be built up, and of course the sidewalk followed the front. The building on the right with the barber pole indicates the Joseph Case Barbering Parlor. Joseph Case was the father of Reen M. Case, the cancer nurse who went on for great fame in treating people with cancer in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. Considering this picture and the young people are standing in front of that barbering parlor, I think that one of those might be Reen Case. That's with the time of this picture and the time of her birth, that seems to coincide with that picture. Another shot of Bracebridge showing the Queen's Hotel on the left. Wonderful building, glorious, famous, and the balconies that overlook the street. Of course, you can see that the streets at this time are dirt streets, and but the sidewalk is there, is built. Great architecture in those days. They put a lot into the appearance of the building, much more than today it would appear. And the river, because Bracebridge is the first falls upstream and the boats could come from the lake comfortably, you see the business that went on here because of the river and Bracebridge. Remember the logging people that came up here and went upstream? There was 5 hotels, and the manufacturing facilities that happened pretty quickly. The bird woolen mill, sawmills, grist mills, and that created a lot of business. Bracebridge grew very quickly. And here we see, I believe there's 4, 5, 6 boats, some smaller, some larger, but most of those were carrying passengers and goods for sale, and they were taken up to the main street, and people would pick up their goods there at the wharf. And another picture from another angle of the same thing. And see here there are 4 boats, large boats, that would haul passengers and freight to serve the people of Bracebridge and the area. This picture is of the Windermere House, original Windermere House. It burnt a few years ago and was rebuilt. This is an indication of some of the wonderful hotels that were built in Muskoka around the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, and they flourished. There were several all over Muskoka Lake, and they were wonderful, elegant places to stay and served a great purpose. Eventually they disappeared. The roads were increasing, and people could get to them by car, and the big boats started to dwindle in number, and so the hotels, for the most part, slipped away. Many of them burnt, and with them went the big boats and the services they provide. The railroad came to Bracebridge in 1885. Not many people know, but they're right here in the middle of Bracebridge. There's a rock cut, and this is it here. It was done by hand, of course. There was no machinery, all by rock drills. And that rock cut just south of the river is 300 feet long and about 60 feet deep. And it was widened in the 1920s because the trains got bigger. Another thing that happened in the 1890s that really provided a great economic boost for the people of Bracebridge was the Tanneries. The Muskoka woods were full of hemlock trees, and still are to a great extent. And there was an element in the hemlock bark that was useful in tanning hides, raw hides. Because of that, there was 4 tanneries in Bracebridge at one time, 2 of a large commercial operation. This is the Anglo-Canadian Leather Company, and it was on the Muskoka River. And they hired people to bring tan bark from all over Muskoka. Most of it came by horse and wagon, but a lot of it came by scows. And my grandparents, my grandfather was one who cut down the hemlock trees, peeled the bark off, and sent it off to the tanneries. Hemlock was discarded as no good, but they found it eventually. That was very good wood. As long as it stayed dry or stayed wet, it served a great purpose, and most of the original Toronto subway was built with Muskoka hemlock lumber. But it couldn't be wet and then dry, and then wet and then dry, because it rotted within 10 or 12 years. A lot of people were employed here in this tannery, upwards of 200, I think. And it was, Muskoka was the largest producer of tan leather in the British Empire for a number of years. Eventually new systems were employed, and they didn't need the hemlock anymore, so the tanneries closed up. Here's the inside of what the tannery looked like. And you see the great vats that were full of chemicals. And in those vats they put the hides as part of their process, and they leave them for a certain period of time, and then they'd haul them out and it would continue. Now the problem was that these tanks were right along the side of the Muskoka River. As a result, years later, when the land was being redeveloped, some of the tanks were still there, and some of the tanks still had hides in them and still full of chemicals. And so they were quite a difficult problem. But they came through it, and some nice developments have been built on those same properties. Bracebridge was always a very conservative town in terms of entertainment. The people are mostly British, but they still liked their liquor. And this was the Civet liquor store, and he brought liquor in to Bracebridge, and he had a building here where he processed it and bottled it, and used spring water from the side of the road, just upstream on the Wilson's Falls Road. And what he did was he mixed the liquor he got with that water and sold it for the same price as he would real liquor. So it was a bit of a rip-off. But the sale of liquor was in dispute in the 1890s or 1930. And there were many groups opposed to selling of liquor, and there was many people that were in favor of selling liquor. Here's one, that this group had a great campaign, international campaign, and they had this sign they had made up and circulated widely: lips that touch liquor will not touch ours. But in every argument, there's always another side. So the other side countered that particular picture with their own, which is also widely used. Wasn't too popular with many people, but it happened. That group was known as the Independent Order of Good Templars, men and women. Once again, the other side of that argument said that those initials aren't interpreted correctly. That's not what it stands for, because they knew that many people were behind the Stop Selling Liquor program. Was also people who like to have a drink every now and then, so they said it should stand for this: I often get tight. But one of the strongest people that fought for reduce the sale of liquor was a drugstore operator. And when the bylaw was finally presented to council and it passed to stop the sale of liquor in Bracebridge, the next day this sign appeared in that drugstore front door. Because everybody knew this druggist was going to try and get the first liquor store sales outlet in Bracebridge. the government was talking about doing it all along, and this fellow figured he'd get on the ground floor. So he supported the prevention of selling liquor strongly. At any rate, he didn't get his way. It was 20 or 30 years later before liquor stores ever opened up in Bracebridge. I'd like to show this picture. It's a business in Bracebridge, Salmon's service station in Bracebridge. It's the bottom end of Main Street, right by the Silver Bridge. And this fellow, dressed in Indian garb, was often going through Bracebridge, coming from Bigwin Island. He was Chief Bigwin of that tribe that inhabited that island. And some people say when I showed them that picture, how come that guy's dressed up like an Indian? No, he's not dressed up like an Indian. That's how he dressed. That's how he came to Bracebridge and caught the train and went out wherever that he wanted to go, and stopped in Bracebridge on the way back and came down and visit Russ Salmon, Bigwin Island. Now this gentleman here, every town has its characters, and this one belongs to Bracebridge. Johnny Moon was a Bernardo homeboy. He came from London, England. At the age of 14, these kids were, and that's what they were, kids. At the age of 14, were sent to Canada and other countries in the Commonwealth. And they came from one home in London that took in waifs and kids and orphans, give them an education, and then sent them off to the countries of the Commonwealth. And there was a lot came to Muskoka. This is Johnny Moon. Now Johnny Moon was a different character. He was contracted to a farm in Draper Township. That's the way they did it. The farmer signed a contract with the Bernardo homes that they would take care of them, give them an education and feed them properly. And in return, they'd work for the farmer. Well, that was fine. But in many cases, the stories of Bernardo home children was pretty bad. They were badly treated. They were considered sick because they came from a sick place, and they were considered not very intelligent. And they were made to sleep in shacks, sometimes in barns, and still work the next morning for whoever they were contracted to. Johnny Moon was faced with that, and he had no time for it. He was a character, and he couldn't tell people telling him what to do. Couldn't take it. And he left there as a contract to another farm, but he couldn't get along there either. So he wound up in Bracebridge, wandering the streets, getting work here and there. But he had a character that was very difficult to understand. He couldn't get along, he couldn't stand supervision. The records show he went to work for the leather company, and he'd work there for 2 or 3 months and get fired for insubordination. But the records also show that 6 months later they'd hire him back. And this went on through Johnny Moon's life. He was seen to us to be quite educated. My mother-in-law knew Johnny Moon, and when she was a child, and he'd walk along the street, and at first they were afraid of them and the other kids that were playing there, so they shunned him. But once they got to know him, he would tell them wonderful stories about England and coming across on the ship, and he was quite well educated, it seemed to us, although I think their education system was much more advanced than ours, and so he might have appeared to be more intelligent than us, but it still wasn't all that great. Anyhow, Johnny Moon stayed here for many years, and he wound up living in this shack in the center of the picture here that was carved into a cave and along the side of the Muskoka River, just upstream from downtown Bracebridge. And you can tell that it was just a clapboard front on it. And in that building, he had dug out holes where he had a place to sleep and a living room. It's quite an excavation. And the men of the town felt sorry for him. So they built another little building you see on the left side of the screen. That's not a bad little building. It's got a shanty roof, windows and doors. But Johnny Moon, being the character that he was, lived in it for a little while, but then went and bought a flock of chickens and put them in the good new building, and he moved back to his cave. You know, and to see and understand his character, you'd wonder why anybody would ever take a picture of that decrepit shack along the side of the Muskoka River. But someone did, and I come across that picture in an elderly gentleman's house, and he was quite proud of the fact. I said, "What is that?" He says, "That's Johnny Moon's place." I couldn't believe it. There was also a lot of wine bottles. He was quite a wino, really. And after a while, and no one really knows what happened to Johnny Moon. He disappeared around 1942 or 43. His building fell down. And a former mayor of the town of Bracebridge, Jim Lang, was playing there as a boy. And he said the place was strewn with books, wine bottles and books. And he took one home, and a boy he was playing with also took one home. Well, what Jim Lang took home that day wound up on the shelf in his parents' place. And when his mother died many years later, in the 1990s, Jim came across that book, and he brought it to me. And what it was, and this is why the story of Johnny Moon will never die, it was an autobiography of Johnny Moon, written in his own hand, and he called it The Trail. It starts out this way: "The following account is the story of my life, Johnny Moon, from August 1882 till this day, 1934. A wonderful story about hardship, abuse, experiences, traveling the boats, what his life was like back in Britain, what it was like here, being dominated by people that he was contracted to. Wonderful story. The other boy that was with Jim at that time, his book was also brought to me. And it is Johnny Moon's Bible. John Albert Moon. And in the back it says, "This new shanty was built on the 22nd day of March, 1933. So it tells you when the building in that picture was built, where he put the chickens. In 1885, the first railroad rolled into Bracebridge. It was quite an event. Any community that was on the railroad line had sustainability, and it was their lifeblood for many years. This was a parade in Bracebridge. They came up with a train, and they'd have the parade around through the community, where it was going to be, how much it was, come one, come all, etc. And this was in Bracebridge, and they shows 3 elephants. One of those elephants died on the way through Bracebridge one year. I don't have any reference to this, any books I indexed, but an old experienced historian told me this story, that it died at the corner of Kimberley Avenue and Manitoba Street. Of course, in that era, there was no backhoes or front-end loaders to dig with, so they dug a hole in the road. They got every capable man that they could find with a shovel, and they dug a hole in the road, and they buried this elephant. And now, it filled with quicklime, of course, to make it deteriorate quickly. Now that roadway and corner has been rebuilt several times over the years, and they've never found any bones. But however, that was a story handed to me. Well, there was a baby hippopotamus born in Bracebridge, died in Bracebridge. It was born here and died here, and his mother try to roll on the baby as they would do in the wilds to protect it from, to cover with mud and protect it from animals attacking it. So it died right in the cage, and they buried it right across from the Bracebridge Public School. And that is recorded as a fact. And again, getting back to the settle of Muskoka, again, this is one of my grandfather's house, and that's where I grew up, and I'm quite proud of it. And that is the end of my story.